Late July 1944, Normandy. Before sunrise, the hedgerows sweat in the cool air, leaf-dark walls stitched across the fields like scars that never healed. Mud clings to boots, exhaust hangs low, bluish and bitter, over idling engines hidden under netting and branches. Somewhere beyond the bocage, German sentries listen to a front that has become a habit. Distant artillery, the occasional burst of machine gun fire, the quiet rattle of vehicles moving at night. Weeks of grinding defense have taught them what to expect from the Americans. Pressure, yes, but also a predictable weight. A war of supplies, a war of method. Then the sky begins to change. It starts as a vibration more than a sound, a deepening hum that seems to come from everywhere at once, above the clouds, beyond the horizon, inside the chest. Men lift their heads without speaking. Even those who've heard it before know what it usually means. Something is about to be erased. And when the first wave arrives, the old rules of the hedgerows will no longer be enough, because the story behind this morning began long before these fields ever learned the word cobra. By the third week of July 1944, the war in Western Europe had settled into something few planners had wanted and many soldiers feared. A slow, claustrophobic struggle measured in yards, not miles. The Allied landings of June 6th had succeeded. 5 beaches had been taken. A foothold on the continent had been secured. But victory had not followed the script of sweeping arrows drawn on maps in London and Washington. Instead, the armies of the United States, Britain, and Canada were pressed into a narrow, crowded lodgment in Normandy, hemmed in by terrain that favored the defender and by a German army that, though battered, was still capable of killing efficiently. For the Americans, the problem had a name: the bocage. Normandy's hedgerows were not hedges in the gentle sense of English gardens. They were ancient earthworks, banks of packed soil topped with thick roots, trees, and tangled vegetation, some rising higher than a man's head. Each field became a natural fortress. Each gap was a kill zone. Tanks struggled to climb them, exposing thin belly armor. Infantry advanced blind, never knowing what waited on the other side. Every advance required coordination under fire, and every mistake was paid for immediately. German forces understood this terrain instinctively. Units like Panzerlehr, the 352nd Infantry Division, and remnants of other formations fought from prepared positions, anchoring machine guns and anti-tank weapons into the hedgerows themselves. Even without air superiority, they used concealment, discipline, and short-range counterattacks to slow the Allied tempo. To many German commanders, this phase of the battle confirmed what they already believed about the American army. The Americans, they said, were powerful but clumsy, rich in equipment, heavy on artillery, dependent on overwhelming supply. Effective only when they could apply mass and time. Against a stubborn defense, they would grind forward, step by step, predictable in their pressure. That perception mattered. Because war is not only fought with weapons, but with expectations. On the Allied side, pressure was building rapidly at the highest levels. The beaches were secure, but ports were still limited. Cherbourg had fallen, yet its facilities were damaged. Every day spent stalled in Normandy strained logistics, morale, and political patience. The longer the front remained fixed, the greater the risk that Germany could stabilize it, or worse, concentrate forces for a counterstroke. Supreme Allied Commander Dwight D. Eisenhower understood the danger. So did General Omar Bradley, commanding the U.S. First Army. They were winning tactically, but time was slipping. To the east, British and Canadian forces under Montgomery were engaged in their own brutal struggle around Caen, pinning German armor, drawing strength, absorbing attention. That effort was deliberate. It was costly, and it was meant to create an opening elsewhere. That elsewhere lay west of Saint-Lô. Saint-Lô itself had become a symbol of the stalemate. Reduced to rubble by bombing and artillery, it sat astride critical road networks, blocking American movement south and west. Its capture in mid-July did not end the problem, but it changed the geometry of the battlefield just enough to offer a possibility. The idea forming in Bradley's headquarters was not subtle. If the hedgerows could not be unraveled one field at a time, then the line would have to be broken all at once. Not everywhere, not evenly, but violently, at a single chosen point. This was not an improvisation born of desperation. It was a calculated acceptance of American strengths, firepower, air dominance, logistics, the ability to compress time through material force. The plan that emerged would later be known as Operation Cobra. To the German commanders watching the Americans pile up supplies, reposition units, and mass aircraft, it looked familiar. Another buildup, another slow push, another example of what some dismissed as American arrogance, the belief that weight alone could substitute for finesse. They did not yet see that the goal was no longer to push the front. It was to make the front disappear. And when that happened, the war in the West would stop being a siege and become a race. Operation Cobra was designed around a simple recognition. Normandy was strangling momentum. The terrain, the dense German defensive mesh, and the narrow Allied lodgment meant every advantage, numbers, aircraft, artillery, was being spent for minimal ground. If that continued, the battle would turn into a prolonged contest of attrition where Germany could still hope to bleed time, preserve key formations, and delay the inevitable long enough to change the wider war. Bradley's answer was not to fight the bocage forever. It was to get out of it. The Guy sector chosen lay west of Saint-Lô, where the American line faced German units already strained by weeks of combat and by constant pressure from Allied air power. The intent was to rupture the German front along a narrow corridor, then flood mobile forces through the breach before the defense could rebuild itself. This was not a classic broad front shove. It was a deliberate wound, cut deep enough that the body could not clot fast enough to stop the bleeding. And the opening blow would not be delivered by tanks. It would be delivered from the sky. By late July, Allied air forces had accumulated an immense capability over Normandy. Fighters to suppress movement and strike targets of opportunity, and heavy bombers that could pulverize a chosen zone with concentrated tonnage. The planners were trying to do something both powerful and dangerous. Use strategic-scale bombing to reshape a tactical battlefield. The risk was not theoretical. The battlefield was crowded. The front lines were close. Errors in navigation, timing, or bomb release could kill the very troops meant to exploit the destruction. But the operational logic behind Cobra accepted risk because the alternative was worse. A slow grind that might cost even more lives over time. When the bombardment came, it was meant to do several things at once. First, it would smash German positions and command posts, collapsing the local defensive structure. Second, it would crater roads and disrupt reinforcement routes, delaying German counterattacks. Third, it would generate shock, physical and psychological, reducing cohesion even among survivors. This was the part that German commanders often interpreted as American, a reliance on overwhelming force, a belief that industry could hammer the battlefield into submission. But Cobra was not simply about destruction, it was about tempo. Because the moment the bombs stopped falling, the critical phase began, exploiting a stunned enemy faster than they could understand what had happened. For the Germans, this was exactly where danger lived. German defensive doctrine prized elasticity, absorbing a blow, counterattacking quickly, restoring a line. But by late July 1944, the German army in Normandy was already operating under major constraints. Fuel shortages, damaged transport, disrupted communications, and constant air attacks made movement hazardous. Reinforcements could exist on paper and still be unreachable in time. Some formations, especially armored units, had been thrown into the Normandy battle repeatedly. Panzerlehr, once a showpiece division, had already been ground down. Other units were exhausted, patched together, and forced to hold terrain that demanded strong infantry density they no longer possessed. In that environment, even a well-led defense could become fragile, and the Americans were changing too. The U.S. Army in Normandy had absorbed hard lessons at high cost. Infantry learned to move with caution through hedgerows, to coordinate closely with armor and engineers, to use artillery and mortars aggressively. Tank crews began improvising solutions. Hedgerow cutters welded to tank fronts, blunt mechanical answers to an ancient terrain problem. Most importantly, the Americans were learning that their true advantage was not only firepower, it was the ability to sustain movement. Because once a breakthrough occurred, the decisive struggle would become logistical. Keeping fuel, ammunition, and maintenance flowing fast enough to keep armored columns rolling, while the enemy's supply and command system unraveled. That is where the German misjudgment lived. To call the American method arrogance was, in a sense, to admit the Americans were willing to bet their entire approach on an assumption that once the line cracked, they could move faster than Germany could recover. If that assumption was wrong, the breakout would stall. The bombed terrain would become chaos. German armor would counterattack into disorganized American forces and turn the breach into a trap. If it was right, the German front would not bend. It would tear. And when a front tears, the collapse is rarely slow. It happens when messages stop arriving, when fuel trucks burn on roads that no longer belong to you, when units begin retreating not because they were ordered to, but because the ground behind them is suddenly empty. Operation Cobra was built to create that emptiness, and once it appeared, there would be commanders ready to pour into it, men whose entire style of war was movement, not siege. Because beyond Normandy, beyond the hedgerows, lay open country, and open country is where armies are judged. In late July, the American front line in Normandy didn't feel like a front. It felt like a series of tight, sweating rooms, each hedgerow a wall, each field a corridor, each gap an open door you were afraid to step through. Infantrymen moved with their shoulders slightly hunched, not from cowardice, but from instinct. A raised helmet edge, a lowered head. In Bocage country, the first man to see the enemy was often the first man to die. German riflemen and machine gunners waited in positions you couldn't spot until they fired. Anti-tank guns sat behind the next embankment, muzzle already aligned with the narrowest opening in the lane. For weeks, the rhythm had been the same. Crawl, rush, freeze, call artillery, listen, then repeat. Exhaustion was not dramatic. It was ordinary. Mud sucked at boots, sweat dried and reformed. Men learned the weight of their own fear, how it sat in the stomach, how it made the hands shake when lighting a cigarette, how it made you listen too hard for noises that were not there. And then, on the morning Cobra truly began, the psychological environment shifted. Even before tanks moved, the air itself announced that something enormous was being committed. When the bombardment rolled over the German line, it did not just kill. It rearranged the world. It told every American soldier in those hedgerows, every exhausted rifleman and mortar crew, that the war was about to stop being a slow shove and become something faster, sharper, and far less forgiving. And that meant the next question wasn't whether they could take the next field. It was whether they could keep up with what came after. To the Germans, American warfare often looked like a machine that needed time to start. Supplies gathered, artillery registered, roads filled with trucks, airfields hummed, then the push came, heavy and direct. It was easy to mistake that for clumsiness, but the method was not simply caution. It was engineering. The Americans were building a battlefield that their own tempo could survive. A breakthrough is not created only by attacking harder. It is created by concentrating the right kinds of force at the right narrow place, then accelerating before the enemy can form a second answer. Cobra's logic treated the bocage not as an endless problem, but as a boundary line. Once crossed, everything changed. The tactic was not to batter every German position equally. It was to paralyze a specific slice of the defense, break it open, and then widen the rupture by motion rather than by more bombardment. That required discipline, because in the first hours after a breach, chaos is everywhere. Smoke, shattered landmarks, confused units, road congestion, broken radios. The instinct of many armies is to slow down, to restore order before moving. But Cobra demanded the opposite. Move to create order behind you, not before you. That's what made the approach feel arrogant to the enemy. It assumed that speed could substitute for neatness, that American columns could operate in partially controlled chaos and still win the race for key roads and junctions. If the enemy recovered quickly, it would look reckless. If the enemy didn't, it would look inevitable. And in Normandy, the Germans were already short on what makes recovery possible: fuel, clear communications, and time. From the German side of the line, Normandy was no longer a campaign. It was a struggle to keep shape. Weeks of fighting had worn down battalions and regiments into something thinner than their maps suggested. Units that were supposed to be neighbors lost contact. Roads that once carried reinforcements became funnels for artillery fire and fighter-bomber attacks. Daylight movement invited destruction. Night movement invited confusion. And yet, orders often demanded the same thing: hold. German command culture, especially under Hitler's increasing control, had become fixated on not yielding ground. The idea was simple. If you hold Normandy, you hold France. If you hold France, you keep the war out of Germany. Retreat was treated not as maneuver, but as moral failure. The battlefield didn't care. A commander in a forward position could see the reality with his own eyes. The longer you stayed, the more your unit dissolved. Men were killed, vehicles disabled, ammunition drained. Even a successful local defense became a trap, because success encouraged you to remain in place while the broader front was changing. When Cobra's bombardment began to rupture the line, the German dilemma sharpened into something brutal. If you commit your remaining armor to seal the breach, you risk feeding precious tanks into a kill zone dominated by Allied air and artillery. If you withdraw, you abandon positions you have bled to hold, and you invite the accusation of defeatism. And the worst outcome was not defeat in battle. It was loss of coherence. Because once units begin to move without coordination, the front is no longer a front. It becomes a scatter of isolated fights, each one courageous, each one doomed, because the war has shifted away from where you are standing. And that is when a collapse begins, not with panic, but with silence on the radio, and an empty road where reinforcements were supposed to appear. American power in 1944 was not just the number of men on the line, it was the invisible architecture behind them. A front is a living thing. It eats fuel, it eats ammunition, it eats spare parts, bandages, rations, batteries, tires, every ordinary object that keeps a modern army functioning. In Normandy, the U.S. Army was learning to push this system forward under fire, across wrecked roads, through bottlenecks that turned every mile into a logistics problem. To many German officers, this looked like a weakness. Too many trucks, too many supplies, too much dependence on material. But Cobra weaponized that dependence. The bombardment and artillery did not exist in isolation. They existed as part of a synchronized method that turned time into a resource. Radios allowed dispersed units to coordinate fires. Artillery could shift rapidly. Air power could punish movement, not by searching blindly, but by striking a battlefield whose roads and targets were being fed to it constantly by observers and planners. Even hedgerows, so effective at hiding defenders, could become a trap when the attackers had enough explosives and enough coordination to collapse positions faster than the defense could reform. This is what German commanders meant when they spoke about the Americans' style. They felt the industrial heartbeat behind it, a steady pulse that didn't rely on brilliance in a single moment, but on the ability to keep pressure continuous. And continuous pressure does something psychological. It makes rest impossible. It makes repair incomplete. It makes every delay feel like the first step toward being overtaken. When Cobra began to open the seam, it was not a single fist. It was a system accelerating, one that could keep moving even when parts of it were damaged, because the depth behind it was vast enough to replace what broke. There are commanders built for siege, and commanders built for pursuit. In Normandy's hedgerows, pursuit had been impossible. Every field had to be cleared. Every tank had to wait for engineers. Every road junction could hide an anti-tank gun. But once Cobra succeeded, the nature of the campaign shifted into the kind of war some leaders were almost waiting for. This is where George S. Patton enters the story, not as a myth, not as a movie character, but as a commander whose strengths and weaknesses both became more dangerous in open country. Patton did not treat movement as a phase. He treated it as a weapon. Where other commanders might pause to consolidate, Patton pushed to exploit. To him, the enemy was most vulnerable, not when pinned, but when forced to move under pressure. When staff work breaks down, when fuel runs short, when orders arrive too late to matter, and the American command system had prepared for this. Once the breakthrough widened, U.S. Third Army could be activated and unleashed into the breach. That didn't mean Patton single-handedly created the collapse. It meant the Americans now had a commander whose instinct matched the operational opportunity. To German officers watching from the other side, this is often where arrogance seemed most obvious. Columns moving deep, bypassing pockets, driving for bridges and road hubs as if resistance could simply be left behind. Sometimes it could, because speed forces impossible choices on the defender. Do you hold a town or fall back to save your division? Do you counterattack into a moving target or retreat and lose the time you needed to recover? Patton's style exploited time the way artillery exploited space. Breakthroughs are celebrated in headquarters. On the ground, they can look like disorder. A collapsing front does not only affect soldiers, it pulls civilians into its wake. In Normandy and the French countryside beyond, roads filled with movement, some organized, some desperate. Refugees pushed carts and bicycles. Families carried what they could. German columns moved among them. Allied aircraft hunted those columns. A road could be a lifeline in the morning and a killing ground by afternoon. Speed changes what mercy means. For Allied soldiers, rapid victory could save lives by ending fights quickly, by preventing weeks of hedgerow attrition that bled platoons white. For German soldiers, speed could mean surrender became the only rational option, because retreat routes vanished before they could use them. But speed also meant destruction arrived before warning. A town that expected a slow front might find itself suddenly inside a battle for a crossroads. A bridge that seemed far from danger could become the hinge of a division's survival overnight. When armored columns appear without pause, there is less time to evacuate wounded, less time to bury the dead, less time to make sense of anything. This is the underside of operational brilliance. The map moves faster than human beings can absorb, and that is why the phrase American arrogance carried more than disdain. It carried fear. It was the fear that the Americans would not simply push you back. They would take away your ability to decide where the next fight happens, because once that decision is gone, the front line doesn't just shift, it collapses. And with the seam widening in Normandy, the decisive night, the one German officers would remember as the moment the line stopped existing, was now close enough to feel. The moment a breakthrough begins, it rarely looks clean. On the map, it is an arrow piercing a line. In reality, it is smoke, broken roads, shattered trees, and scattered men trying to understand whether the world around them is still organized or already slipping into something worse. When Cobra struck, the initial effect was violence compressed into minutes. The bombardment pulverized chosen sectors of the German front, not evenly, not politely, but with a brutal intent, to break the local structure of defense so thoroughly that even survivors could not reassemble it in time. Positions that had held for days or weeks were reduced to torn earth and wreckage. Communications were cut. Landmarks vanished. Officers who controlled small sections of the front suddenly had no reliable way to confirm where their neighbors were, or whether their own units still existed in coherent form. Then the Americans moved. Infantry advanced first through the disturbed ground, not as a triumphant wave, but as men stepping carefully through chaos, alert to pockets of resistance, to mines, to guns that survived the storm. Engineers followed, clearing paths, widening gaps, making the breach usable for armor. And once the breach could carry vehicles, the weight of American doctrine arrived. Tanks and armored infantry began pushing through the seam. Artillery shifted forward. Traffic control on narrow roads became a battle of its own. Columns of trucks, medical vehicles, supply convoys, tank transporters, and command cars all struggling to pass through limited corridors without locking into jams that would paralyze the whole effort. This was the unglamorous core of American warfare, organization under pressure. To the Germans, the danger was not merely the tanks, it was what followed them. Every mile the Americans gained meant their own artillery could be repositioned. Their forward air controllers could call strikes deeper. Their logistical lifeline could extend into territory that, until hours ago, had belonged to Germany. And the German response was constrained by time. In a stable defensive battle, Germany could compensate for Allied material superiority with skill, choosing ground, preparing positions, counterattacking locally with armor. But in the first hours of Cobra, stability vanished. The Germans had to make decisions with incomplete information. Counterattacks were planned while roads were already being cratered and strafed. Orders were issued while radios failed and messengers struggled to find units that were no longer where the map said they should be. Some German formations fought fiercely in place, turning hedgerows and villages into strong points even after the wider line began to deform. They inflicted losses. They delayed. They proved again that the German army could still fight. But delay is not the same as recovery. What Cobra created was a widening difference in tempo between attacker and defender. The Americans could generate speed not only through boldness, but through sustainment. When a tank was knocked out, another could be brought forward. When a unit became disorganized, fresh formations could pass through, keeping the pressure continuous. The Germans, by contrast, were increasingly forced to defend with what they had immediately at hand. As the breach expanded, the battlefield began to change character. The hedgerow maze started giving way to more open terrain, where armor could maneuver with fewer natural barriers. Here, the American advantage became clearer. Not only more tanks, but more fuel to keep them moving, more maintenance capability, more supply trucks, more artillery ammunition, and a growing confidence that the sky belonged to them. For German commanders, the operational picture darkened rapidly. They could attempt to seal the breach with armor, but their armor was limited, exhausted, and exposed to Allied aircraft. They could pull back to a new line, but pulling back required coordination, and coordination was exactly what the bombardment and the mounting pressure were stripping away. A front line is not merely a place where soldiers stand. It is an agreement between units, between commanders, between the flow of information and the flow of supplies, that the battlefield still has a shape. Cobra attacked that agreement. As American forces pushed deeper, German units began to lose their grip on the edges of the breach. Flanks became unstable. Road junctions came under threat. Command posts moved repeatedly, not as a planned maneuver, but as a response to danger arriving faster than expected. In the distance, the sounds changed too. Not the steady duel of artillery across a fixed line, but the irregular clatter of vehicles retreating, the sudden roar of air attacks on roads, the sharp bursts of small arms fire around crossroads and villages, fights happening not on a neat front, but wherever columns collided with resistance. And as the Americans widened the opening, the decisive question was no longer whether the Germans could hold the hedgerows. It was whether they could prevent what came next. A penetration so deep and so fast that, by the time they tried to reform a line, the line would already be behind them. Because the real turning point in a breakthrough is not the breach itself. It is the moment the defender realizes the enemy is no longer fighting to push you back. They are fighting to get past you. And with daylight fading and engines still rolling through the seam, that realization was beginning to spread along the German front, one unit at a time, like a cold truth arriving too late. Night in a collapsing front is not quiet. It is the sound of vehicles moving without headlights, trying to follow roads they can no longer trust. It is the sharp crack of gunfire in places that were rear areas a day earlier. It is staff officers hunched over maps, lit by a single hooded lamp, drawing lines that are already obsolete. By late July into early August 1944, the German defense in Normandy was entering that kind of night. In a stable battle, darkness can offer relief. It hides movement. It gives time to repair, to reorganize, to breathe. But in the wake of Cobra, darkness became a multiplier of confusion. Units that had survived the bombardment were no longer certain where the next friendly position was. Messages that might have restored order arrived late, or not at all. A road junction that was supposed to be secure could already be threatened by American patrols or armored spearheads probing forward. The Americans, meanwhile, did not stop simply because the sun was gone. They slowed where they had to. Traffic jams, blown bridges, wrecked lanes, but the operational pulse continued. Engineers worked in the dark. Staff officers pushed new routes to units. Artillery remained active, ready to disrupt any German attempt to mass for a counterattack. And behind it all, the American supply system kept feeding the advance, inching its way forward through the same narrow corridors, accepting congestion as a price of momentum. For German commanders, the crisis was not one dramatic defeat. It was a chain reaction. A battalion pulls back to avoid being cut off, only to find the unit beside it has already gone. A regimental headquarters relocates, only to lose contact with two of its battalions in the process. A counterattack is ordered, only for the armored elements to arrive piecemeal, low on fuel and under constant threat from artillery and aircraft when daylight returns. This is how a front line begins to dissolve, not with a single shout of panic, but with the gradual disappearance of certainty. At the tactical level, some German positions fought well into the night, holding villages and hedgerow strongpoints, firing until ammunition ran low. But tactical skill cannot compensate indefinitely for an operational situation that is collapsing around you. A platoon can hold a roadblock. It cannot restore a coherent front once the larger structure is gone. The Americans exploited that truth by focusing on what mattered most in a pursuit: roads, bridges, crossroads, and communication nodes. An armored column does not have to destroy every enemy unit it bypasses. It only has to outrun them, take away their routes, and force them to choose between surrender and destruction. When junctions fall, the retreat becomes a funnel. When bridges are seized or demolished, the retreat becomes a trap. When headquarters are displaced, orders stop arriving in time to matter. Overnight, the German situation began to resemble something far more dangerous than a retreat. It began to resemble disintegration. There were practical signs: abandoned vehicles that could not be repaired or fueled, trucks burned on roads where movement had become too risky, staff cars separated from their units in the dark, wounded left behind because the ambulances could not reach them, soldiers marching along ditches, rifles slung, not because they had been ordered to withdraw in a planned manner, but because the ground behind them had become uncertain and the ground ahead had become lethal. And there were psychological signs. The front that had seemed solid, hedgerow by hedgerow, was now full of gaps. Gaps do something to an army. They invite fear, and fear invites haste. Haste invites mistakes. Mistakes invite catastrophe. In headquarters, German officers tried to describe the situation in the language of organized war: withdraw to a new line, seal the penetration, restore contact. On the roads, reality was faster than language, because the Americans were no longer only attacking the front, they were taking away the rear. By dawn, the landscape revealed what night had concealed. Smoke columns rose from wrecked convoys. Roads were crowded with exhausted men and broken equipment. Positions that had been expected to hold were simply empty. Units gone, not always in good order, sometimes not even accounted for. In places, American patrols found themselves looking into space where German resistance had been yesterday, and the speed of the advance suddenly felt unreal. This was the moment German commanders would later describe with bitter clarity. The Americans had been called arrogant because they trusted in mass, in logistics, in air power, in method. But what made the collapse feel overnight was not a single explosive victory. It was the compounded effect of tempo. The Americans moved faster than Germany could reassemble, and each hour widened the difference. A front line can survive defeat. What it cannot survive is being outpaced. And as the sun rose over Normandy, the question was no longer whether the Germans could stop the breakout. It was how much could be saved before the pursuit became irreversible, because the consequences of a broken front do not remain local. They spill outward, into the countryside, into the cities, and into the next phase of the war. In the hours after a front breaks, there is a brief window where the battlefield feels weightless. The attacker advances into territory that seems to open by itself. Resistance appears in fragments, roadblocks, scattered strongpoints, isolated anti-tank guns firing until they are flanked or destroyed. The defender, forced into movement, begins to lose the ability to choose where the next fight will happen. The war stops being a line and becomes a flow. For the Americans in early August 1944, this flow carried them out of Normandy's hedgerows and into the kind of country their doctrine was built to: exploit. Roads mattered now. Junctions mattered. Bridges mattered, and the American Army, once judged slow, began to look frighteningly fast when the terrain no longer strangled it. As mobile forces pushed outward, towns that had expected weeks of battle found themselves liberated in days or even hours. Some German units still fought with discipline, withdrawing while leaving rearguards behind to delay pursuit. Others simply ran out of fuel, ran out of ammunition, or lost contact with higher command and were swallowed by the speed of events. The signs of collapse accumulated. Abandoned guns pushed into ditches, half-tracks, with their engines stripped. Ammunition crates left unopened beside the road. Columns of prisoners moving the opposite direction, dusty and silent, guarded by men who looked almost as tired as they did. But even in this phase of success, the Americans discovered that speed has a price. Every mile of advance stretched the supply line. Fuel consumption rose sharply with continuous movement, especially for armor. Roads became crowded not only with military traffic, but with the physical debris of the retreat. Destroyed vehicles, blown bridges, cratered sections, and refugee movement that complicated routing. Mechanical breakdowns multiplied. A tank that could fight all day in a static battle might lose hours to a damaged track or overheated engine in a pursuit where maintenance had to be done on the move. This was the paradox of American strength. Their advantage lay in logistics, and logistics could become their constraint. Because victory was not simply a matter of driving forward. It required feeding the advance, pushing fuel and ammunition to the spearheads at the same rate the spearheads were consuming them. When supply could not keep up, even the most aggressive exploitation had to pause, and pauses are where defenders find oxygen. Still, in the immediate aftermath of the breakout, German forces were paying the larger price. A retreat conducted under pressure is an exhausting thing. Units that might have formed a new line were instead forced to keep moving, often at night, often without adequate rest, often under the knowledge that daylight could bring air attack and artillery strikes. Staff work became increasingly reactive. Orders to hold were issued, then rescinded. Counterattacks were planned, then abandoned when fuel and cohesion were insufficient. The Germans were not simply losing ground. They were losing time, the most irreplaceable resource in a modern campaign. And as the Americans pushed deeper into France, the initial exhilaration of the pursuit began to collide with a hard, unavoidable truth. An army can outrun its enemy, but it can also outrun its own ability to sustain itself. Which meant the story was not yet finished, because the next question was not how far the Americans could drive in open country. It was whether the Germans could recover enough, just enough, to turn a headlong collapse into a fighting withdrawal and force the Allies to pay again for every mile. A broken front does not mean a broken army, not immediately. Germany's forces in the West were battered, depleted, and increasingly under pressure from above to hold ground that no longer made operational sense. But even in retreat, the German army still possessed a dangerous skill: the ability to salvage coherence from disaster, to form rearguards, to sacrifice space for time, and to rebuild a defensive shape before the attacker could deliver the final blow. That effort began the moment the Germans recognized what Cobra had done. Where they could not hold, they tried to delay. Where they could not delay, they tried to escape. And where they could escape, they tried to fall back toward lines where geography and preparation might help them again, toward defenses that, on paper, promised stability, rivers, choke points, and eventually the fortified systems of Germany's western frontier. But the act of recovering under pursuit required three things Germany was running short of: fuel, functioning communications, and intact formations. In many places, German commanders could still order withdrawals, They could still direct rear guards to hold key crossings. They could still use pockets of armor to strike at exposed spearheads. Yet the larger truth remained. Any recovery effort had to be executed inside an environment dominated by Allied air power, abundant artillery, and an enemy whose logistics system, while strained, was still capable of pushing forward enormous quantities of fuel and ammunition. On the Allied side, friction began to show. This was not the friction of losing battles. It was the friction of winning too fast. Supply depots lagged behind the front. Fuel became the currency of movement, and the fastest formations consumed it at a rate that could exhaust even a well-organized system. Roads, already damaged and crowded, became arteries that could clog. A unit at the front might have the enemy in sight and still be forced to pause because gasoline did not arrive in time. Even victory has bottlenecks. And in those bottlenecks, the Germans found opportunities, not always to stop the Allies, but to slow them, to avoid encirclement, to keep some formations intact long enough to fight again. This is the deeper consequence of a front line collapsing overnight. It is not merely the dramatic image of a defeated enemy running. It is the strategic rearrangement that follows. The Allies gain freedom of maneuver, but they inherit new problems. They are no longer trapped in hedgerows, but they must now control vast spaces. They must protect extended supply lines. They must decide whether to concentrate on a single thrust or maintain a broad advance across multiple axes. For the Germans, the collapse forced an equally brutal set of decisions: hold too long and risk annihilation, withdraw too soon and lose the territory and resources the regime demanded they defend, counterattack recklessly, and feed scarce armor into a battlefield where replacement was increasingly impossible. In this way, Cobra's aftermath became more than a tactical victory. It became a case study in modern war, how a force that looks methodical can become lightning fast once conditions allow it, and how an army's true resilience is tested not only in attack, but in its ability to maintain structure while being hunted. The American Arrogance label had been built on an assumption that mass meant slowness, but the pursuit exposed a different reality. Mass, when organized, can create speed, and speed, when sustained, can produce collapse. By the time the dust settled from the first phase of the breakout, the Germans had lost something that could not be easily replaced. Not just ground, not just equipment, not just prisoners. They had lost the ability to dictate the pace. And in war, when you lose control of pace, you begin fighting not for victory, but for survival. One improvised line at a time, one river at a time, one road junction at a time, hoping that somewhere ahead the map will finally stop moving. In war, insults are often a form of comfort. To call an enemy arrogant is to believe their confidence will outrun their competence, that their momentum will collapse under its own weight, that their method will fail when the battlefield turns complicated. In Normandy, German commanders had reasons to believe it. They had watched the Americans fight hard for small gains in the hedgerows. They had seen roads clogged with vehicles, supply columns stretching back toward the beaches, and they told themselves it was proof of dependence, proof that the Americans were strong only when the war stayed slow. But the breakout revealed what that dependence really was. It was not fragility. It was depth. The Americans had built a way of war that could absorb chaos without stopping, because behind each rifle squad and tank crew was an entire system designed to keep pressure continuous. When Cobra punched a seam through the bocage, that system did what it had been waiting to do. It accelerated, not perfectly, not without mistakes, but relentlessly enough that the German defense could not regain shape before the next blow landed. And that is why the front line seemed to collapse overnight. Not because German soldiers suddenly forgot how to fight, but because modern warfare punishes any army that loses the rhythm of time, any army that cannot move, communicate, and resupply fast enough to keep its parts connected. A unit can be brave and still be cut off. A position can be strong and still be bypassed. A counterattack can be well planned and still arrive too late to matter. In the quiet after such a collapse, the battlefield looks almost ordinary again. Fields, roads, villages, smoke thinning in the distance. But the meaning is already written into the ground. A line that breaks does not simply move backward. It changes who controls the future. And somewhere in that widening space beyond Normandy, as engines carried forward into open country and the war turned into a pursuit, the old German judgment, American arrogance, was replaced by something colder. The realization that the Americans had not been slow. They had been building momentum. And once released, momentum does not negotiate. It does not pause for pride. It simply rolls forward until something strong enough stops it, or until the road ends.